pencil shoot up into the sky and thought, now is the time for me to feel a pang, or even a twinge, but I don't at all. I feel relieved, in fact, but that's probably the result of getting rid of that fool Clifford. He crossed the field briskly, pulling off his jacket and discarding his tie as he went. His ground car remained where he had parked it, in an area clearly marked "No Parking." They'd left him an old car that wasn't worth shipping to the stars. How long it would last was anybody's guess. The government hadn't been deliberately illiberal in leaving him such a shabby vehicle. If there had been any way to ensure a continuing supply of fuel, they would probably have left him a reasonably good one. But, since only a little could be left, allowing him a good car would have been simply an example of conspicuous waste, and the government had always preferred its waste to be inconspicuous. He drove slowly through the broad boulevards of Long Island, savoring the loneliness. New York as a residential area had been a ghost town for years, since the greater part of its citizens had been among the first to emigrate to the stars. However, since it was the capital of the world, and most of the interstellar ships, particularly the last few, had taken off from its spaceports, it had been kept up as an official embarkation center. Thus, paradoxically, it was the last city to be completely evacuated. And so, although the massive but jerry-built apartment houses that lined the streets were already crumbling, the roads had been kept in fairly good shape and were hardly cracked at all. Still, here and there the green was pushing its way up in unlikely places. A few more of New York's tropical summers, and Long Island would soon become a wilderness. The streets were empty, except for the cats sunning themselves on long abandoned doorsteps, or padding about on obscure errands of their own. Perhaps their numbers had not increased since humanity had left the city to them, but there certainly seemed to be more, striped and solid, black and gray, and white and tawny, accepting their citizenship with equanimity. They paid no attention to Johnson. They had long since disassociated themselves from a humanity that had not concerned itself greatly over their welfare. On the other hand, neither he nor the surface car appeared to startle them. The old ones had seen such before, and to kittens the very fact of existence is the ultimate surprise. The Queensboro Bridge was deadly silent. It was completely empty except for a calico cat moving purposefully toward Manhattan. The structure needed a coat of paint, Johnson thought vaguely, but of course it would never get one. Still, even uncared for, the bridges should outlast him. There would be no heavy traffic to weaken them. Just in case of unforeseeable catastrophe, however, he didn't want to be trapped on an island, even Manhattan Island. He had remembered to provide himself with a rowboat. A motorboat would have been preferable, but then the fuel difficulty would arise again. How empty the East River looked without any craft on it. It was rather a charming little waterway in its own right, though nothing to compare with the stately Hudson. The water scintillated in the sunshine, and the air was clear and fresh, for no factories had spewed fumes and smoke into it for many years. There were few gulls, for nothing was left for the scavenger. Those remaining were forced to make an honest living by catching fish. In Manhattan, where the buildings had been soundly constructed, the signs of abandonment were less evident. Empty streets, an occasional cracked window, not even an unusual amount of dirt, because, in the past, the normal activities of an industrial and ruggedly individual city had provided more grime than years of neglect could ever hope to equal. No, it would take Manhattan longer to go back than Long Island. Perhaps that, too, would not happen during his lifetime. Yet, after all, when he reached Fifth Avenue, he found that Central Park had burst its boundaries. 59th Street was already half jungle, and a lush growth spilled down the avenues and spread raggedly out into the side streets, pushing its way up through the cracks it had made in the surface of the road. Although the plaza fountain had not flowed for centuries, water had collected in the leaf-choked basin from the last rain, and a group of gray squirrels were gathered around it, shrilly disputing possession with some starlings. Except for the occasional cry of a cat in the distance, these voices were all that he heard, the only sound. Not even the sudden blast of a jet regaining power. He would never hear that again. Never hear the stridor of a human voice piercing with anger. The cacophony of 100 television sets, each playing a different program. The hoot of a horn. Off-key singing. The thin, uncertain notes of an amateur musician. These would never be heard on Earth again. He sent the car gliding slowly, no more traffic rules, down Fifth Avenue. The buildings here also were well built. They were many centuries old and would probably last as many more. The shop windows were empty except for tangles of dust, an occasional broken, discarded mannequin. In some instances the glass had already cracked or fallen out. Since there were no children to throw stones, however, others might last indefinitely, carefully glassing in nothingness. Doors stood open and he could see rows of empty counters and barren shelves fuzzed high with the dust of the years since a customer had approached them. Cats sedately walked up and down the avenue or sat genteelly with tails tucked in on the steps of the cathedral, as if the place had been theirs all along. Dusk was falling. Tonight, for the first time in centuries, the street lamps would not go on. Undoubtedly when it grew dark he would see ghosts, but they would be the ghosts of the past, and he had made his peace with the past long since. It was the present and the future with which he had not come to terms, and now there would be no present, no past, no future, but all merged into one, and he was the only one. At 42nd Street pigeons fluttered thickly around the public library, fat as ever, their numbers greater, their appetites grosser. The ancient library, he knew, had changed little inside. Stacks and shelves would still be packed thick with reading matter. Books are bulky, so only the rare editions had been taken beyond the stars. The rest had been microfilmed, and their originals left to Johnson and decay. It was his library now, and he had all the time in the world to read all the books in the world, for there were more than he could possibly read in the years that, even at the most generous estimate, were left to him. He had been wondering where to make his permanent residence, for, with the whole world his, he would be a fool to confine himself to some modest dwelling. Now he fancied it might be a good idea to move right into the library. He stopped the car to stare thoughtfully at the little park behind the grimy monument to neoclassicism. Like Central Park, Bryant had already slipped its boundaries and encroached upon 6th Avenue. Avenue of the World, the street signs said now, and before it had been Avenue of the Nations and Avenue of the Americas. But to the public it had always been 6th Avenue, and to Johnson, the last man on earth, it was 6th Avenue. He'd live in the library, while he stayed in New York that was. He'd thought that in a few weeks, when it got really hot, he might strike north. He had always meant to spend a summer in Canada. His surface car would probably never last a trip, but the Museum of Ancient Vehicles had been glad to bestow half a dozen of the bicycles from their exhibits upon him. After all, he was, in effect, a museum piece himself, and so as worth preserving as the bicycles. Moreover, bicycles are difficult to pack for an interstellar trip. With reasonable care, these might last him his lifetime. But he had to have a permanent residence somewhere, and the library was an elegant and commodious dwelling, centrally located. New York would have to be his headquarters, for all the possessions he had carefully amassed and collected and begged and, since money would do him no good any more, bought, were here. And there were by far too many of them to be transported to any really distant location. He loved to own things. He was by no means an advocate of Rousseau's complete return to nature. Whatever civilization had left that he could use without compromise he would, and thankfully. There would be no electricity, of course, but he had provided himself with flashlights and bulbs and batteries. Not too many of the last, of course, because they'd grow stale. However, he'd also laid in plenty of candles and a vast supply of matches. Tins of food and concentrates and synthetics, packages of seed should he grow tired of all these and want to try growing his own. Fruit, he knew, would be growing wild soon enough. Vitamins and medicines, of course, were he to be really ill or get hurt in some way, it might be the end. But that was something he wouldn't think of, something that couldn't possibly happen to him. For his relaxation he had an antique hand-wound phonograph, together with thousands of old-fashioned records. And then, of course, he had the whole planet, the whole world to amuse him. He even had provided himself with a heat-ray gun and a substantial supply of ammunition, although he couldn't imagine himself ever killing an animal for food. It was squeamishness that stood in his way rather than any ethical considerations, although he did indeed believe that every creature had the right to live. None the less, there was the possibility that the craving for fresh meat might change his mind for him. Besides, although hostile animals had long been gone from this part of the world, the only animals would be birds and squirrels, and farther up the Hudson, rabbits and chipmunks and deer. Perhaps an occasional bear in the mountains. Who knew what harmless life form might become a threat now that its development would be left unchecked?